And you're live.
Okay, this is the conference committee on H.454. It's May 29th at 9 in the morning, and we're going to hear this morning from the tax department.
Sorry for the very small table.
No, we love the small table. How are you doing?
Like we're in 12th grade again.
Yeah. Hi, for the record, Rebecca Samrock, Deputy Commissioner, Vermont Tax Department.
Jake Bellman, Senior Fiscal Analyst, Tax Department.
I think the reason you're here is to talk to us about some of the studies that have been called for in H.454, and we want to get the tax department to weigh in on capacity to handle what's in there.
Yeah, happy to. Should we choose the order or do you want to?
Just sort of like, well, yes, that would be great. And sort of, generally one of the task forces you didn't have time for, and then we added all these other studies in here. So just wanted to, I know that some of the things that we're studying, you've studied already. So just wanted to check in on your capacity for studying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, we love to study.
I know you do.
There you go. Yes, also we do have a lot of irons in the fire, especially this summer. There's three things that I think there could be more, but I think there are three. There's an education advisory committee where the House had that starting up in July 2025 and the Senate had it starting up in July 2027. We could start there.
Yeah, and I'll just say that less of a capacity question. I think with the 2025 start date, this would be July 2025, the tax department convening a group Jake, I would love for you to go into the details of what this group is charged with doing and the members of it, but it just feels like we're in a very fresh moment where many of these, a lot of shifting policy sands, some of the things that this group is tasked with looking at, we're envisioning a future of an education system that don't have these components anymore, like a property tax credit, for example, and just seems like a lot of potentially duplicative work that doesn't totally align with the direction that this body is moving right now. So I think pushing it back would be helpful, and then also giving folks time to rethink the details of the charge could be helpful for us as
I
well.
appreciate that detail.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're suggesting push back by what are we suggesting?
Well, the Senate version 2027, we're certainly comfortable with. I think, for me, just not convening a group in this context next month or in July would be the big ask.
So what you're saying is let's let the dust settle a little bit before we dive in.
Exactly. Thank you. I'm happy to chat more in details if that's helpful, but if that's sufficient, we can move on.
I think that's sufficient.
Okay, great.
Do another easy one. Easy-ish one. Homestead exemption. The Senate has a slightly different layout of the homestead exemption. And basically the clock ran out on trying to fine tune it. Tax department would like an opportunity to further refine it. And the first thing it asks us to do a study over the summer, which is great. The first thing on there is about how the homestead exemption might interact with this new property tax rate environment that's being contemplated. And that's a very important thing that has not been looked at. But when we're looking at communities where the tax rate might go up a lot, such as maybe Barrie, for example, it's important to understand that the homestead exemption, which more than half of the state would be getting, can help mitigate that. So we want to look at the interaction of that. We want to kind of do a better job phasing out the two cliffs in the current system. There's a small cliff at 47,000 of income.
That's easy to fix today even, but yeah.
Okay. There's a much bigger cliff at 90,000, which is producing the L and then the blob in your table. So the Senate had a new proposal, which is good, but there's on either side of the cliff, there's issues. So we could take another look at that. The Senate also had the constraint of it being revenue neutral, which we can work with. And then there's also in that study that we're assigned with, it asks us to talk about inflationary, how to inflate the income amounts and the house site value amounts, which should be part of the new program. So those are all good things to study, and we would like to do that study.
Question, with all due respect, you're the one who brought the homestead exemption to us in the context of the governor's proposal. And so, and I know you've been working really hard at sort of checking in on it throughout the whole year, and I really appreciate the collaboration with JFO on that. It seems like some of what you're talking about, thinking about, you've already actually thought about quite extensively. I know there's always more work to be done, and we can sort of tweak things next year. But the question of how it interacts with the foundation formula, is that really not something that you thought of, that you all were able to think about? Because were AOE and tax just sort of operating independently until we all came together in January?
No. So what I mean by that is, for both tax and JFO, we were imagining the homestead exemption as if it was in place in FY 25, and that's what
Okay.
produced the colorful tables. But it would be FY some future year. And what would and both House and Senate are thinking that there might be a universal homestead rate that's the same everywhere. So that really throws a wrench into things. And I want to see what the homestead exemption would look like if the universal rate was $1.25 or $1 or something in between. And I really want to look at the interaction in places, like I said, where the universal rate may be higher than what they have now. How does the homestead exemption help support the lower income homeowners?
And I think that's a question that the House was thinking about through our process, and that's why we were talking about sort of everything becoming active in the same year, so that all the countervailing forces would cancel each other out as much as possible, and we would definitely need to do an adjustment in that year to make sure. And I am curious to see how the transition that the Senate built in, which I'm grateful for, will interact with that. I have we've been talking about sort of blobs and Ls and reds and greens and yellows and blues, and like these are real, and I've absolutely have been doing it myself. I just sort of in this moment want to say, like, these are real taxpayers, right? And when I look sort of across, say, Senate proposal or current law, right, where we have someone making between $30,000 and $35,000 a year with a home that might be worth $500,000 that they bought for $100,000, right? You talk about that a lot, Senator Cummings, right? Or 40,000, sure. I can't imagine a life like that, but sure. You know, under current law, they're paying more than 10% of their income in property taxes, and I think you all are aware of that. But even under the Senate proposal, they're still they're spending even more than that. Than 10% in current law. And that's a wild thing that I sort of, you know, when we think about the edges of this, I want us to be really careful that it isn't blues and greens and reds. It's like real people who are struggling to pay their bills. So I just, you know, appreciate all your work to date. And I'm excited how far we got on the House proposal to make sure, you know, as many people as possible were better off here. I think folks will be, I want to make sure that we're putting something in current law that we're continuing to tweak as we always do, rather than sort of putting off any of these things to make sure that I think everything we do is always going to be subject to change. And I think we know that particularly about education law and to some degree about tax law. And so I think it's important for people to be able to anticipate and trust that we're doing everything we can to minimize their tax you know, their high tax responsibility this year, with a reassurance that we're going to be studying it. That's all. But I'm glad that you're excited about working on it this summer, and I hope we can keep on talking about it.
Yeah, I'm excited for it to become part of the law.
Yeah.
You know, the current law has the house site limit of $400,000 covered, which is all states have limits on how much property tax relief they provide. Usually it's a dollar amount. Vermont has several limits. They have 400,000. We have 5,600 on the education credit, 8,000 overall. There should continue to be limits. It shouldn't be an unlimited thing.
Mhm.
But we're happy to work with the Senate's version and fine-tune that.
We didn't have a limit in because there was like barely any fiscal impact of having a limit, but I would think a limit makes sense. I'm glad that in all the versions you're not kicking anyone off eligibility the way we do under current law. I think that's great.
Yeah, and just, taking a step back, we've been really pleased to see the direction that both bodies went with the homestead exemption. I think it's been, more and more fine tuned, and that's, I think, part of the enthusiasm for getting to take, another analytical look at it. And, as you said, we're really, the unit for the homestead exemption is the individual, because this is like where someone's income situation, their home value and their rate environment, it's all different for each individual. So that's why having, as much clarity as we can about what that overall rate environment will really help us hone, the design of the program to really, meet as many individual taxpayer circumstances where they are.
One thing I'm curious about you all studying is that we have an income limit on this that is feels somewhat arbitrary, and that it's stuck within the box of what we have in current law, because that's the data we have to model impacts, basically, right? And I think there's a lot of people who think that that income limit should be a little bit higher or not be just a, stark cliff. So I'm wondering what it will take for you all to be able to have the data that you need to really study what it would look like to extend that to say, we use 175 as a cap in a lot of other tax programs, right? And I know that you can data match, but it's far from perfect. So I'm curious what you would need to be able to really explore going up to 175.
Yeah, so what Representative Kornheiser is talking about, we get household income for the people who are applying for a credit. The current income limit is $115,000, likely to decrease in the future for the factors that she just mentioned. It's kind of a natural place where two lines meet, and because of property appreciating faster than income, it's pulling in each year. We can certainly create that file and share it with JFO, as we have many times over the past decade. It's just a little bit more work of marrying homesteads with income tax returns. And then you can pull in AGI and use it, which is adjusted gross income, and use it as a kind of a proxy for household income, because we don't know exactly. But that's the best that we can do.
How far off do you feel like it is?
We've studied that.
Yeah.
I know I don't remember the answer.
Happy to follow up.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for most people, it's pretty close. It's just when you get into weird situations that you get these variances. But for most people, it's a good proxy.
And when you said sort of 115 is a natural point, I think you mean like a mathematically natural point.
Right.
I think it's from like a taxpayer perspective, it's a fairly arbitrary point.
Yeah. To me, when I see two lines crossed, that says natural.
Yes.
It does feel arbitrary, and it's hard to explain. Why does it keep coming in? And with the homestead exemption, that's going to be something that's in law, and you can advance it each year, and you could even make it bigger pretty easily.
Okay. Last thing is just, I think using the term revenue neutral in the context of the education fund is like somewhat confusing. Given that we are spending a different amount on homestead exemptions every year over the last decade for all of the reasons that, the natural lines and such. And so I'm going to keep on taking issue with that frame because that's my job.
So if I understand this right, you're suggesting the Senate's Section 61 looking and maybe altering it to pick up a lot of what we're talking about business.
I wouldn't call that a proposal. I would just say that's the conversation we're having right now.
That's right. Hold on. I think you mean section 53A
Oh, thank you.
on page 51.
Oh, not the classification study?
No, we're talking about the homestead exemptions right now.
Okay. That's same idea.
I think it's a different idea.
No, I meant same idea of using the study.
Yes.
Yeah.
And everything we discussed.
But in here, we're talking about putting it in law and then studying it.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
Yes, because we're putting it in law because it's pretty fleshed out at this point, and the studying is like a fine tuning of it.
Mhm. Appreciate that nuance.
I think I know where you're going. Yeah, so.
And then the next study,
It's the classifications.
yeah,
Um, I could start it off.
okay,
So we have studied this at least twice, or me personally twice, but maybe others more. But so this is the classification study is the house has two existing classifications plus two more. And then it has a implementation report and a data gathering report as it gets closer to prime time. The Senate has homestead, non-homestead, as we do now, and a study for the tax department, which is a little bit more involved than prior studies because it asks us for definitional options, which we've never done before. But the reason that's important is because last year there was a property transfer surcharge passed on second homes, quote. And it said that, basically they have to be fit for year-round habitation. That has been challenging to administer. So we have gotten some pretty complicated cases that we need to decide about whether a house is fit for year-round habitation. And that has been challenging. So that's just a few hundred properties a year. But now that definition would expand out to tens of thousands of properties, and they would be taxed at potentially a higher rate. That's TBD, but it could be higher down the line. So we need to flesh that out about what exactly that means. Is there another option there? We want the tax code to have bright lines, not to be fuzzy, and we appreciate your work on S51 to not have a fuzzy tax code. So if this is going to be something that's part of the revenue mix, it needs like much more fleshing out of the definitional options and what the reporting requirements are going to look like. And then a decision could happen.
I just want to, before I forget and get it lost in the mix of the summer, I hope you can bring recommendations on the second home property transfer tax to us next year if you have changes that you need to be made to definitions there. Because this is the first I've heard that it was fuzzy for you, and I want to make sure that we're cleaning that up if we need to.
Yeah, if there's hopefully, miscellaneous tax bill, maybe we'll have something.
Yeah, certainly be diving deep.
So in the House proposal, we have essentially a year to study, a year to collect data, and then I think another 2 years before implementation. I might have I don't have my timeline in front of me. I meant to print it before I got here today.
Essentially 2 years to study, I think.
Oh, okay.
December 2026.
So that's a lot of studying.
Implementation plan.
Yeah, implementation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And that feels like a doable timeline for studying? And
2
implement,
years.
yeah,
Certainly.
okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between them is that the Senate is much more open-ended,
Mhm.
with giving us some authority to form the definitions.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of considerations there, especially on the one I just mentioned about fit for year-round application. Could we do it a different way? Could we do it based on value? Like in Hawaii, we need to understand what Montana is trying to do right now with second homes. So it's much more open-ended in that regard. And that is why we're hoping for it. Another thing I'll say.
Montana just passed different property tax for second homes.
Yeah, another thing.
I just didn't know if everyone else read the article.
They also don't define.
No, I know,
second
I know.
homes, so,
I know,
yeah.
it was like realtor.com and I was like digging.
It feels to me like when something is on the books, it's difficult to get it repealed. We're experiencing that with the landlord certificate language right now. Hopefully we can get that worked out, but last year there's some pretty major changes without our approval. And now, we're just hoping that one of these housing bills gets enacted. Otherwise the landlord certificate is going to blow up. So, when something is on the books already, then it's like a great burden, that we're fighting against. But when it's, tax tell us how to do it, it's easier to work with.
I appreciate that. And, we've twice said tax tell us how to do it. And you have, for very good reasons, said, there are political concerns about this and also some implementation concerns. I know that in the House, in testimony, you said we could probably do 3 categories, 4 is a stretch.
I think our testimony said
Is that
focus on
you?
one. Focus on one new one, yeah.
One new one,
Yeah.
yes, which would be 3
Yeah.
categories, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were hoping that the General Assembly would flesh out what is a second home.
Mhm.
That's what we were hoping for.
Okay.
Didn't happen. But,
Okay.
it's still the same as the property transfer returns.
Mhm.
It's like, all right,
Okay.
we have not been told what the definition is, so let's cook up some possibilities.
So I'd be curious if you're able to give us later today, as you have worked with that second home property transfer tax definition, if you have any recommendations for fleshing that out based on the work you've done so far this year on that, but we
They're
can,
pretty case specific,
Yeah.
we have fleshed out some FAQs on our property transfer tax page to help guide folks transferring properties, but
Okay.
they end up being very fact specific, like does the water go to the house year round? What's the heating system like?
Mhm.
What's the road like?
Yeah.
It feels a little wild to be defining something down to that level, but if we don't, then we're left with tax
Absolutely.
administrators making these cases that have making these decisions that have major implications for.
and I think
folks.
all 3 of those are things that we've all sort of thought about as part of that definition. I think they're common sense in their weird way.
Yeah, and to Rebecca's point, the determination of habitable on a year-round basis is gonna fall on local officials. And so we need to talk to them about that and how you would do it. Can you sort these out? Can you sort out the camp that doesn't have insulation from the one right next door that does have insulation? So, yeah.
And
we-
how do
we
you
wanna talk
see
about
that fitting in with your, and I'll stop soon, I'm sorry. Does anyone else have a question before I just continue on with this? How does this fit into the reappraisal change work? Just that there are gonna be like more eyes on more properties. Okay.
We're
Okay.
comparing, we're asking, we, the department, PBR and the, municipal assessing community is facing a lot of change in the near term between what we're trying to do with regionalizing
Mhm.
the reappraisal system, which is really important work that we're, grateful that we as a state are, embarking on. And then also, contemplating a big shift in work where we're evaluating the present day use of everyone's property every year. Whatever role that municipal officials end up playing in that process is, it's gonna, I think it'll be hard to insulate them completely given the directions that we're exploring here. So it's a lot all at once. Just, concerns that you're familiar with.
If we were to end up with the Senate's section 61, the study, is there anything that you would like added to that list?
I think how did we work with?
We did.
Yeah,
I think we were comfortable with the language. It's open and I felt like gave us the flexibility to recommend different more implementable definitions. The one ask we did make in the Senate is actually to have the study do a year earlier because we thought that would be more relevant to folks, thinking about adding classifications if we.
December 15/25.
Right.
Okay.
But
We did, with the contemplation that the new funding environment might be starting in FY 28. So we offered that, saying like, if this is your timeline, then we could try to produce this earlier, but whatever we offer the flexibility to you now to, if the new funding environment is going to be later, that study could come later, but it's really up to you.
Thanks.
okay. Quicker timeline serves all parties for certainty though, so.
When you are administering homestead and non-homestead, are you determining how folks are using, homestead is a property use, right? So are you determining how people are using the difference in those properties?
That is a good question. Non-homestead's default, right?
Yeah.
So all property in Vermont is non-homestead. Until somebody declares that as their homestead.
Mhm.
And it is that, those are two existing classifications based on use. It is challenging to administer. And what happens is, people submit homestead declarations, but towns sometimes say, I don't think you got this one right. And they get in a back and forth with the tax department,
Mhm.
which is complicated. Issues of domicile are very difficult.
Yeah.
So, yes, we're administering it, and it's a tricky thing to do.
And heavily reliant on the participation of every single homestead property owner
Great.
to make that designation, so.
Thanks.
And if the rates between homestead and non-homestead now are similar, you know, non-homestead is higher in a third of towns. But as you get into a rate environment where there's a big difference, then you could get more behavioral response.
And I don't know if we're contemplating a big difference. Maybe. Yeah.
Anything else for us?
Thanks, for
Thanks for the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, thank
happy to
you.
Come back on any other questions as we move forward.
Thank you.
Any questions from anybody? No.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay.
We could pick up where we left off yesterday and continue through as we were sort of,
That will be fine.
talking about positions. We pretty much wrapped up the
Are you just keeping track of page numbers?
well, since there's only 50 of them, so that's good. So we are at sparsity, basically. Pages of 27. It's
So I really, I think what we sort of ended on, I just want to offer, I think that moving to a sparse school is much more towards, I think, everyone's legislative intent and how the modeling was done for the foundation formula, and I appreciate that correction. And zip code, I think we all agreed yesterday was weird. I think love to think it's sort of an interim, I don't know if it's perfect, but municipality might be a good stand-in, but maybe we can talk about that later. Yeah, okay. As we sort of continue to have, staff in the GIS office work through that. I think there's a question as we move into much larger districts about whether it should be a combined grant and not if we need to do sparsity and small schools, or whether we should just have one that's small schools in sparse areas. And I think I think with larger districts, that's going to become a much more relevant question, especially given that in the idea that transportation aid would be entirely covered by the state and not at the local level.
What do you mean by a combined grant?
That instead of having a sparsity grant and a small school grant in a geographically necessary, et cetera, you'd have one grant that is for small schools in sparse areas.
That's what we think. Small schools in sparse areas.
Okay, I think you have
But what-
to,
Yeah, what Representative Cornine is saying, instead of having a small schools grant, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Instead of having a small
Always.
schools grant, having a grant for a small school in a sparse area, that there would just be one. That would-
and I'm,
Again, that.
again, I'm like floating that as an idea. It's something that we're just beginning to think about. And in doing that, I think might make a lot more sense in these much larger districts we're considering.
Because the sparse areas will be
So because,
less in the larger.
so under current law, with our current weights, transportation aid is half covered by the district with their local general fund dollars and half covered by the state, right? In both versions of the bill, the idea that transportation aid is fully covered by the state is established. I think, of course, there are questions about how that's going to be administered, and like those are very important questions for next year, because a fully refundable grant is very different from a matching grant in terms of how people behave.
Yes.
But a lot of the costs of sparsity might be mixed up in transportation. And so having it be one package might be further towards our policy goals right now. And so I'd love us just to think about that, and including me thinking about it. It's just really just an idea. It is not a proposal.
As far as property tax credit after Jake and the fact that what are your thoughts?
Can we keep on?
So the issue with the sparsity then is if we were to not have sparsity be a factor, then we have to figure out which small schools and why.
So we already have that in the bill.
Sort of have sparsity as a proxy for by necessity. That language is still in there.
In both versions, it's by necessity, yeah. And I think the idea is that the payments would be combined, but the eligibility would be a joint eligibility as well. And so just thinking about that, like I said, it's not a. Further in the foundation formula, one flag I wanted to bring up is as you do the transition.
Page 31.
Page 31, Peter. Somewhere else in the bill that is not in the section by section because we both agreed to it is the idea that tuition payments match weighted foundation formulas, right? Like the money follows the student. If we're prorating the foundation formula, we should also that should be prorated as well, because otherwise we're going to see a real squeeze in mixed delivery districts if we still have mixed delivery districts. So that would just be for the 4 years of the transition. And I think it's just a cross-reference that needs to be added. Do you want me to use more? Should I use more words?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Not sure.
And I think we could have staff sort of share language that might help get around that. But so elsewhere in the bill, we've agreed that the money follows the student. Tuition payments to independent schools are set at whatever that student payment would be, right? Weighted student payment. For these 4 years of transition, we're having some districts are going to have lower or higher education opportunity payments for their students. I want to make sure that we have the right cross-reference here so that that's true for also tuitioning. Because
And so that no school gets a big windfall in tuition and no school.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it applies across the, I want to make sure it applies across the.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
we just have to figure out how to do the language.
Yeah, and I think they're working on that. Okay, I'm just gonna check there. Yeah. On page 32, can we have this be 2026 and just call it a nice compromise here?
Page 32.
What is it?
The Ed Fund Advisory Committee starting in 2026.
Where do we give this up?
That's the first study that Deputy Commissioner Samaroff was talking about.
They asked to have that delayed a year.
They just now they asked to delay it a year. You all said 2 years. We said no, said 2025 because that's what was 127.
So, okay, so move it.
Right? Just
Just, there's a true splitting of the difference, okay.
I love it. Isn't that great? Thank you.
You can agree.
We can. Fresh day.
One conference committee I was on a few years ago, the only issue was trying to find a compromise between the numbers 1 and 3.
How long did that take?
That's amazing. So over here in supplemental district spending,
What section?
section 46, page 33. You all moved to long-term membership instead of weighted long-term membership. I think that makes a lot of policy sense. I think there's a real question that as the administration originally proposed this, they were thinking about a much lower base rate. And so I'm just, I think that for the transition, maybe the 10% that we have here makes sense. But I wonder if we want to be very clear that we're going to reevaluate that in the future or have that percentage titrate down as we get a few years out of the transition. When I think about the policy implications of the work that we're doing here and the pre-Brigham, post-Brigham environment, we know that any sort of like systems sort of veer towards inequity slowly, right? Like post Act 60, we had a fairly equitable system. 30 years later, we have a very inequitable system. The supplemental district spending, I think, is the space where the greatest degree of inequity is likely. And so I'd like us to be monitoring it or purposefully titrating it down to force us to monitor it. So if you could give that some thought.
Well, what if we just, I think after this thing gets going, there's every 5 years, the base and weights will be. What if we just include it in that evaluation? Does that make sense just to?
Maybe. I guess I just don't trust us very much. And so I wonder if setting that titration down and then evaluating it makes more sense, but I don't let's talk about it. Yeah. I'm not stuck on that. I'm just, for whatever reason, having a distrust of future legislators today.
Go through very heavy times. And when you finish, we do tend to not want to go there again because it was painful in the first place.
Yes.
If it's just on the base, it's actually something that's less than 10% anyway. So of overall spending anyway.
Yeah,
It's just as a.
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm reassured by that.
It's pretty hard to get much smaller.
These sort of technical changes around Secretary of Education doing the thing makes sense.
Actually, since we.
Yeah.
What section we just talking about? 47?
46. And then 47 is technical changes related to a larger issue. And that's true through on page 36. It's a technical change that's, I think, fine with us. Through 39. And then we have a new tax rate transition in 41. I think there's a real question about whether we should set this transition at the beginning rather than recalculating it every year. It seems to me that predictability is more important in these times than exact numbers. But I'm okay.
And I'm not.
Yeah.
It's a point.
Yeah. Okay.
Are you suggesting using the version 48A?
So I think we don't have any transition at all. I'm eternally grateful that you came up with a transition. Thank you. You have it recalculated every year of the transition, and I think it might make more sense to have it set,
I see.
set all 4 years set at the beginning, so folks know what they're getting into.
Then we set,
Yeah.
One issue none of us have dealt with is, and we won't know what the impact is until we look at districts. But we have some significantly lower spending districts. And then many of them are because they are significantly poorer communities. And even if we're transitioning them in order, there's a good chance the base tax rate, the state one, is going to be significantly higher than what they're spending now.
Yes.
It will continue that inequity, that it will be a lot easier for financially
Mhm.
wealthier communities to pay that base rate than for the smaller. Now, if the districts might even that out, but they might not, and that's just something we'll have.
So I also want to thank you. I misspoke about my own notes, and it's actually the EOP payment that I want to set at the beginning. The tax rate is set at the beginning. The EOP is recalculated annually. So you have 2 transitions. So that's 45B that I was hoping will set the gap at the outset. I thought they were set up the same way, but they're not. I'm sorry.
To Senator Cummings' point, which is an important one.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of the purpose of having a somewhat redone but more generous homestead exemption program.
Thank you. Yes. So I think the purpose of the bulk of the work we did in Ways and Means this year around both the homestead exemption and the new property classes is to be able to account for that exact challenge, which is sort of what has been keeping me up at night personally since January. It's vitally important we bring everyone up in their spending, but
Sure,
yes,
that's going to be
That's
offset.
yes, and all at the same time.
Mhm.
Yes. Um, so 41. On that point as well, I've been hearing from a lot of folks that are sort of, we've all talked at this table and in this body about the fact that we are, even yesterday, we are projecting numbers out 5-6 years from now. That's a wild exercise. We have recalculations implicit in this bill. We have a due diligence to do a lot more work next year and the year after. I don't know if it's helpful to be even more explicit in this bill about like, yes, we're going to really look at all this like the year before it happens.
Yeah, we, in the Senate Edmonton, we had a couple of sections where we set out tasks for the 26th legislature, knowing full well, of course, we
Yeah.
have to do it, but we did it just to acknowledge these are things that have to happen
Yeah.
on this timeline. So
Yeah.
that's something that
Okay.
is worth doing, even though we know that it's.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I think
Intent language.
public,
Yeah.
there's a lot of taking numbers and applying them to
Mhm.
today's situation that is causing some wide scale panic. And I think the more we say those numbers are irrelevant, yes, that we will be calculating everything as more information is brought in.
Yeah.
Based on a different reality.
Yeah.
And sort of, we only have a few minutes left, but going to the property tax credits, page 45 and 44, the homestead exemption. I just I think what we both did is imperfect. I think what the administration gave us was imperfect. I think it's really important that we implement something this year and continue to study it. As Jake said, of the levels of imperfection, I think the House version leaves more people better off, and that's a really important thing for us to communicate to the public as we are taking on revolutionary changes in our education and property tax system. I can't, in any good conscience, pass a property tax change at this scale that leaves more Vermonters worse off than they are under current law, which is a problematic system. I understand the box that you all were working on, but I think we need to break the box a little bit. I think we need to even ask Jake to study moving up to 175 in the future. But that is really very important to us.
We know the difference in cost.
It's different every year, right? Like the whole thing is a moving bubble.
What the difference has been this year? Just so we have something.
I don't have that in front of me.
So
The slide we saw yesterday. Thank you.
I have that note, I wasn't sure
Yeah.
that's right. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not, I think it's really important not to think of it as sort of extra revenue because it's all part of the ed fund. And so there's other things we're going to be doing in the ed fund that I think will compensate for that. I think there's other places we're going to be reducing costs that are going to compensate for that. So I think it's important that we think of it all as an interrelated picture and not just like a standalone. Yes. But do you think we need to make up that
In
45?
fact, I think everybody would prefer being able to give more relief to the middle class.
Okay, great.
It's just a matter of.
How to do that? Absolutely.
So I think it might be hard this year to put something in the statute that costs under $45 million.
Mhm.
So are you talking about like, having an actual, like using one of these two or having a placeholder that we're gonna work on this over the summer? We're gonna.
Talking about using the House version, working on it over the summer to improve it even more. I think there's a tweak that we could make at Jake talked about 2 cliffs. And I think the House version, the cliff at around 47 is actually like pretty fixable and we just didn't at the last minute. So I'll offer something for that. Studying it over the summer and none of this, the effective date for this is a few years out, right? It's the same effective date as all of our other changes. It's the same effective date as the foundation formula and the new districts. And so I think it's going to be important for us to show in our fiscal note and before we walk out the door, the way all these numbers interact to make sure that we, on the other side of this in 5 years, are not spending more than we are under current law. And I think we can do that.
It is because we're dealing so far in the future. We need to be careful not to promise more
Yes.
we can deliver. We don't.
But we also just can't promise less.
No,
Yes.
I think you're right, that we should make sure that more people that we don't have fewer people being protected than we do now. I would think that would be important.
My concern is the people that are being protected aren't protected.
Well, yeah.
Well, and that's,
Representative.
and I think that's what we need to be absolutely working on. Also, the house site value cap that you all have, I think makes a lot of sense.
But 5 years out, housing values, they changed rapidly up. They have in the past changed rapidly down. The economy, I mean,
Yeah.
There's so many variables that we could be in a whole different set of numbers that we'll have to recalculate where this goes. And the bells are.
So we've got to come back at 11. So,
Yes.
And what do we want to say is our agenda for 11?
To add the administration.
Okay.
Administration.
And I have a committee meeting, so I won't be here, but I have memorized.
Is there anything you'd like us to tell the administration for you?
I have memorized the letter.